Marcus Whitfield controls billion-dollar deals with ease, but watching a homeless man teach his autistic son to smile changes everything he thought he knew about success. What happens next will challenge every assumption about worth, family, and the true meaning of wealth, revealing a secret that transforms not just one life, but an entire community. A story that proves love knows no social boundaries and will make you question what really matters in life. The gleaming towers of downtown Seattle reflected the morning sun like mirrors, each window a testament to ambition and achievement. On the 42nd floor of Whitfield Industries, Marcus Whitfield stood behind floor-to-ceiling glass, surveying his empire with the detached satisfaction of a man who had conquered every mountain he'd set out to climb. His tailored Italian suit hung perfectly on his lean frame, every thread worth more than most people earned in a month. At 45, he had built a fortune that could sustain generations, yet something in his steel-gray eyes suggested that victory had come at a price he was only beginning to understand. "Mr. Whitfield, your son's therapist is online too," his assistant Sarah announced through the intercom, her voice carefully neutral. She had worked for Marcus for 8 years and had learned to navigate the invisible landmines that surrounded any mention of his personal life. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Tell Dr. Morrison I'll call her back." The lie came easily, as they always did when it came to Daniel. His son, his beautiful, unreachable 8-year-old son, who lived in a world Marcus couldn't enter, no matter how much money he threw at the problem. The intercom crackled again. "Sir, she says it's urgent. About Daniel's progress." Progress. The word stung like a physical blow. In Marcus's world, progress was quarterly earnings, stock prices, acquisition deals. Progress was measurable, quantifiable, controllable. But Daniel's progress existed in a realm where Marcus's expertise meant nothing, where his wealth was just expensive noise against the silence of his son's autism. "Fine, put her through." Dr. Morrison's voice filled the room with its practiced warmth. "Marcus, I wanted to discuss Daniel's response to our new social integration program. He's been showing some remarkable—" "Is he talking yet?" Marcus cut her off, the question sharp as broken glass. It was always the same question, the one that revealed how little he understood about his son's world. A pause. "Marcus, we've discussed this. Communication isn't just about verbal. I have a board meeting in 10 minutes, doctor. Just tell me if we're making progress worth the $15,000 a month I'm paying your clinic." The silence on the other end stretched like a chasm. When Dr. Morrison spoke again, her voice had lost some of its professional warmth. "Daniel is making incredible progress, but it's not the kind you can measure in quarterly reports. Maybe if you spent more time, I'll have Sarah schedule something." Another lie. Marcus ended the call and turned back to the window, his reflection staring back at him like an accusation. Somewhere across the city, his son was learning to navigate a world that Marcus had built but could never truly inhabit himself. The phone buzzed again. "Sir, Mrs. Whitfield is here to see you." Marcus's stomach clenched. Rebecca never came to his office unless something was wrong. Their marriage had become a careful choreography of avoidance. Two people dancing around the crater that Daniel's diagnosis had blown through their lives. She blamed Marcus for working too much. He blamed her for not understanding that work was how he processed pain, how he tried to build something meaningful from the ashes of his dreams of a normal family. Rebecca entered without knocking, her blonde hair pulled back in a way that accentuated the exhaustion around her green eyes. Once, those eyes had looked at him with admiration, with love. Now they held something that looked dangerously close to contempt. "We need to talk about Daniel," she said without preamble. "I just spoke with Dr. Morrison. She says he's making progress." "Did she tell you about the incident yesterday?" Rebecca's voice carried an edge that made Marcus's chest tighten. "What incident? Of course you don't know. You were in Singapore, closing another deal while your son was having a meltdown at the park because he saw a balloon fly away and couldn't understand why no one could bring it back." Marcus felt something twist in his gut. "Kids have tantrums, Rebecca. It's normal. Normal. Rebecca's laugh was sharp and hollow. Marcus, he screamed for 2 hours. 2 hours. Do you know what it's like to watch your child in that kind of pain and not be able to help him? Do you know what it's like to see other parents looking at you like you're doing something wrong? Marcus wanted to reach for her, to close the distance that seemed to grow wider every day, but he didn't know how. I'm trying to provide for our family. Everything I do is for Daniel, for his future. He doesn't need a trust fund, Marcus. He needs a father. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Marcus had heard them before, but today they seemed to pierce something vital in his chest. I don't know how to be what he needs. For a moment, Rebecca's expression softened, and Marcus glimpsed the woman he had fallen in love with 15 years ago. Then learn, before it's too late. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. I'm taking Daniel to Lincoln Park this afternoon. The therapist suggested more outdoor exposure, sensory integration. If you want to try being a father instead of just a provider, you know where to find us. After she left, Marcus stood alone in his corner office, surrounded by the symbols of his success. Awards lined his shelves, newspaper clippings documented his achievements, and his bank balance could buy almost anything in the world. Everything except the ability to comfort his son when a balloon disappeared into the sky. The board meeting passed in a blur of revenue projections and strategic initiatives. Marcus found himself staring out the window toward Lincoln Park, knowing that somewhere in that green space, his wife was trying to help. Their son makes sense of a world that seemed determined to overwhelm him. He thought about the trust fund he had established for Daniel, the special schools he had researched, the experimental therapies he had quietly funded. All of it felt suddenly meaningless, like trying to build a bridge out of money to span an ocean of misunderstanding. At 3 o'clock, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. He cancelled his remaining meetings and drove to Lincoln Park, his BMW, navigating the Seattle traffic with the kind of efficiency that money could buy. He told himself he was just checking on them, making sure they were safe. But deep down, he knew he was searching for something he couldn't name, something that had been missing from his life for longer than he cared to admit. Lincoln Park stretched along the Puget Sound waterfront, a green oasis where families gathered to let their children play and burn off energy. Marcus parked near the playground and scanned the area looking for Rebecca's distinctive blonde hair. Instead, his attention was caught by something that made his breath stop in his throat. Daniel was sitting on a bench near the water, his small body rigid with the kind of tension that usually preceded a meltdown. But he wasn't alone. Beside him sat a man who looked like he had been carved from the rough edges of hard living. His clothes were worn and patched, his hair long and unkempt, his face weathered by sun and circumstance. A shopping cart filled with what appeared to be his entire worldly possessions sat nearby, marking him as one of the city's invisible homeless population. Marcus's first instinct was protective anger. Where was Rebecca? Why was she allowing a stranger, a potentially dangerous stranger, to interact with their vulnerable son? He started toward them, ready to intervene, when something stopped him cold. The man was humming. It was a simple melody, nothing Marcus recognized. But Daniel's rigid posture had begun to relax. The stranger's voice was rough but gentle, like sandpaper smoothing wood. He wasn't looking at Daniel directly. Marcus had learned that direct eye contact often overwhelmed his son, but his presence seemed to create a bubble of calm around them both. "You know what I think?" the man said, his voice carrying just far enough for Marcus to hear. "I think that balloon found exactly where it needed to go. Sometimes things that look lost are just finding their way home." Daniel turned his head slightly, not looking at the man, but acknowledging his words in a way that made Marcus's chest tight. His son rarely responded to anyone outside their immediate family, and even then, connection was fragile and fleeting. "My name's Eddie," the man continued, still humming softly between words. "I've been watching the water here for a long time, and I've learned something interesting. Want to know what it is?" Daniel didn't respond verbally, but he shifted on the bench, turning his body slightly toward Eddie. It was the kind of subtle engagement that Marcus had spent thousands of dollars trying to achieve through therapy sessions. The water never stops moving, but it's not lost. It knows exactly where it's going, even when we can't see the path. Kind of like that balloon, kind of like people sometimes. Marcus found himself frozen, watching this impossible scene unfold. Eddie's voice had a quality that seemed to bypass Daniel's usual defenses, speaking to something deeper than words. The homeless man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a smooth stone, polished by countless hours of handling. This rock came from a mountain somewhere, traveled down a river, rolled along the bottom of the Sound for who knows how long. Now it sits in my pocket, and every day it reminds me that everything finds its place eventually. Daniel's hand moved slowly, hesitantly toward the stone. Eddie held it out without pressure, without expectation, simply offering a connection that required nothing in return. When Daniel's small fingers closed around the stone, something in Marcus's chest cracked open. "Where is that boy's mother?" A sharp voice interrupted the moment. Marcus turned to see Rebecca approaching, her face a mask of protective fury. She had spotted Eddie and was clearly preparing to rescue their son from what she perceived as a threat. But as she got closer, she slowed, sensing the same inexplicable peace that had stopped Marcus. Daniel was still holding the stone, still sitting calmly beside Eddie, looking more settled than he had in weeks. "Ma'am," Eddie said, standing slowly and stepping back to give Rebecca space. "I was just keeping your boy company. Hope that's all right. He seemed a little upset when I first saw him." Rebecca's prepared confrontation died in her throat. She looked at Daniel, then at Eddie, then at the scene that defied every assumption she had about danger and safety. Thank you. He was having a difficult day." "We all have those," Eddie replied with a gentle smile. "Some days the world feels too loud, too fast, too much. Your boy just feels it more honest than most of us." Marcus watched from his concealed position as Rebecca's defensive posture softened. There was something about Eddie's presence that seemed to calm not just Daniel, but everyone around him. It was the opposite of Marcus's effect on people. Where Marcus commanded attention through power and status, Eddie invited peace through simple acceptance. "What's your name?" Rebecca asked, her social training kicking in despite the unusual circumstances. "Eddie Peterson. I've been in the neighborhood for a while. Try to keep an eye on the kids who play here. Your Daniel, he's got something special about him. Sees things the rest of us miss." Special. The word came out of Rebecca with a mix of pride and pain. Special was what the doctors called Daniel when they were being diplomatic about his challenges. Special was code for different, for difficult, for not quite right. But when Eddie said it, it sounded like exactly what it was supposed to mean, set apart for something remarkable. "You see how he watched that balloon?" Eddie continued. "Most kids would have been sad it was gone. Your Daniel, he was trying to understand where it went, like he knew there was more to the story. That's not a problem to fix. That's a gift to nurture." Marcus felt something shift inside him, a foundation he hadn't even known existed beginning to crack. He had spent 2 years thinking of Daniel's autism as something to overcome, a barrier between him and the son he had imagined. But watching Eddie interact with Daniel, he began to see something different. Not a broken child who needed fixing, but a different kind of child who needed understanding. "I should go," Eddie said, glancing at his cart. "Don't want to overstay my welcome." "Wait," Rebecca said quickly. "Daniel seems so comfortable with you. How do you—" Eddie's weathered face crinkled with something that might have been pain or wisdom. "I had a son once. Different than Daniel, but special in his own way. Lost him in Afghanistan 12 years ago. Since then, I guess I've been learning to see kids the way he would have wanted me to see them, for who they are, not who they're supposed to be." The words hung in the air like a blessing and a curse. Marcus felt them settle into his chest, heavy with meaning he wasn't ready to process. Eddie had lost his son. Marcus's son was right there, healthy and alive, and he'd been treating him like a problem to solve instead of a person to love. "What was his name?" Rebecca asked softly. "Jeremy. He was 23 when he died. Marine like his old man. Wrote me a letter before his last deployment. Told me he hoped I'd learn to see the world through kids' eyes again someday. Took me a while to understand what he meant." Eddie reached into his cart and pulled out a worn photograph. A young man in military dress uniform, smiling with Eddie's same gentle eyes. He always said the best conversations happened when you stopped trying to fix people and started trying to understand them. Daniel had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention he usually reserved for mechanical sounds or repetitive patterns. Something about the rhythm of Eddie's voice, the cadence of genuine emotion, seemed to speak to him in a way that clinical therapy sessions never had. "Would you like to come back tomorrow?" Rebecca heard herself asking, surprising herself with the invitation. Daniel responds so well to routine, and if you're here regularly. Eddie's eyes widened slightly. "Ma'am, I appreciate the kindness, but I'm not exactly the kind of person most folks want around their kids. Maybe most folks don't know what they're missing," Rebecca replied, and Marcus could hear his wife's voice warming with something he hadn't heard in years: hope. From his vantage point, Marcus watched this exchange with growing amazement and discomfort. His wife was inviting a homeless stranger to spend time with their son, and it felt more right than anything that had happened in their family for months. It challenged every assumption he had about protection, about appropriate boundaries, about what their son needed. Eddie looked at Daniel, who was still holding the smooth stone, still sitting peacefully in a way that usually took an hour of careful preparation to achieve. "I could be here tomorrow afternoon if that would help. Same time, same bench." Sometimes consistency is the best gift you can give a child who sees the world differently. After Eddie gathered his belongings and walked away, pushing his cart toward whatever shelter the evening might provide, Rebecca sat beside Daniel on the bench. She didn't try to take the stone away or rush him toward the car. She simply sat with him in the quiet space that Eddie had created, watching the water move in its ancient patterns. Marcus approached slowly, his footsteps careful on the gravel path. When Rebecca looked up and saw him, her expression cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been cautious welcome. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "Long enough," Marcus replied, settling on Daniel's other side. His son didn't look at him, but he didn't pull away either, which Marcus counted as a small victory. "I saw what happened with Eddie. And what do you think about it?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the stone turn over and over in Daniel's small hands. "I think I've been trying to solve the wrong problem." Rebecca's intake of breath was sharp enough to make Daniel glance in her direction. "What do you mean?" "I've been trying to fix Daniel's autism instead of trying to understand Daniel." The words felt foreign in his mouth, like speaking a language he was just beginning to learn. "That man, Eddie, he didn't try to change anything about our son. He just met him where he was." "Marcus." Rebecca's voice carried a warning, as if she was afraid to hope for too much change too quickly. "I know I haven't been the father Daniel needs. I know I've been hiding behind work because it's easier than facing the fact that I don't know how to connect with my own son." Marcus felt something break loose in his chest, a dam giving way to years of suppressed emotion. But watching Eddie with him today, I realized something. Daniel isn't broken. I am. The words hung between them like a bridge neither had dared to build before. Daniel looked up at his father, not meeting his eyes, but acknowledging his presence in a way that felt like absolution. "So what do we do now?" Rebecca asked. Marcus looked at his son, at his wife, at the water that moved with ancient purpose toward destinations it had never seen. "We learn. We start over. We figure out how to be the family Daniel deserves instead of trying to make him fit into the family we planned." As they sat there together, Daniel began to hum, the same simple melody that Eddie had shared, passed from one unlikely teacher to a small boy who heard music in places others only found silence. Marcus closed his eyes and listened, really, listened to his son's voice for what felt like the first time. The next afternoon, Marcus did something unprecedented. He left the office at 2 o'clock. His assistant Sarah stared at him as if he had grown a second head when he announced he was taking the rest of the day off for family time. In 8 years of working for him, she had never known Marcus to leave early for anything that wasn't a business emergency. "Should I reschedule your meeting with the Peterson Group?" she asked. Consulting his calendar, Marcus paused, struck by the coincidence of the name. Peterson? The Seattle Development Project. They're looking for investors for their affordable housing initiative. Something clicked in Marcus's mind, a connection forming that he wasn't ready to examine too closely. "Actually, move that to tomorrow morning. And Sarah, do some research on that project. I want to know everything about their plans, their leadership, their impact on the community." "Of course, sir. Is there anything specific you're looking for?" Marcus thought about Eddie, about the shopping cart that contained a man's entire life, about the wisdom that could grow in the most unlikely places. "I want to know if they're actually helping people or just moving problems around." Lincoln Park looked different in the afternoon light, softer somehow, as if the morning's revelations had changed not just Marcus's perspective, but the very texture of the world around him. He found Rebecca and Daniel at the same bench where yesterday's miracle had occurred, but today Daniel was pacing, his small body tight with anxiety. "He's been asking for Eddie all morning," Rebecca explained as Marcus approached. "Well, not asking exactly, but humming that melody and looking toward the water. I think he expected him to be here." Marcus felt a stab of disappointment that surprised him with its intensity. He had been looking forward to watching Eddie work his quiet magic. Again, to learning more about this man who seemed to understand Daniel in ways that eluded his own father. "Maybe he'll still come," Marcus said, checking his watch. It was only 2:30, and Eddie had mentioned afternoon. They waited. Daniel's pacing became more agitated, and Marcus could see the signs of an impending meltdown building in his son's rigid shoulders and rapid breathing. Rebecca pulled out the bag of comfort items they always carried, noise-canceling headphones, a weighted blanket, fidget toys, but Daniel rejected them all with increasingly desperate gestures. "Daniel, sweetheart, let's try the breathing exercises," Rebecca suggested. But Daniel was already too far into his spiral to accept intervention. Marcus felt the familiar helplessness rising in his throat. This was why he stayed at the office, why he buried himself in problems he could actually solve. Watching his son in distress and being unable to help felt like drowning in slow motion. Then he heard the humming. Eddie appeared from behind a cluster of trees, pushing his cart with unhurried steps. He wasn't looking directly at Daniel, but his presence immediately began to shift the energy around them. The simple melody he hummed was the same one from yesterday, and Daniel's frantic movement slowed as the familiar sound reached him. "Afternoon, folks," Eddie said to Marcus and Rebecca, but his attention remained focused on the water, giving Daniel space to approach the calm. He offered, without pressure. "Yesterday's stone still working?" Eddie asked the air, not demanding an answer, but offering connection. Daniel's hand went to his pocket, where Marcus now realized he had been carrying the smooth stone Eddie had given him. The physical reminder of yesterday's peace seemed to anchor him, and his breathing began to slow. "You know what I learned about stones today?" Eddie continued conversationally. "I was talking to this old fisherman down at the pier, and he told me something interesting. He said the smoothest stones aren't the ones that stayed safe on the shore. They're the ones that got tumbled around by the waves, that got knocked around until all their rough edges wore away." Marcus found himself leaning forward, drawn into Eddie's storytelling despite himself. There was something about the man's voice that created space for listening, that made even difficult truths feel like gifts. "Makes a person think," Eddie mused, about whether getting knocked around might not be the worst thing that could happen to a stone, might be how it becomes something beautiful. Daniel had stopped pacing and was now sitting on the ground near Eddie's feet, not close enough to touch, but within the radius of his calming influence. It was remarkable to watch. Daniel self-regulating in response to someone who wasn't trying to regulate him at all. Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find Rebecca looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" she asked quietly. "That depends on what you're thinking. That we're about to ask a homeless man to help us raise our son, and that it might be the sanest thing we've ever done." Marcus looked at Eddie, who was now pulling something from his cart, a small notebook, its pages worn soft from handling. He opened it carefully and began to read, not aloud, but with the kind of concentration that suggested sacred text. "Mr. Peterson," Marcus called out, using the formal address as a way to request attention without demanding it. Eddie looked up, his eyes curious but not startled. "Yes, sir? I wonder if we could talk, all of us, I mean, about Daniel, about yesterday, about what you see when you look at our son." Eddie closed his notebook carefully and gave Marcus his full attention. "I see a boy who experiences the world with unusual intensity. I see parents who love him but are scared of not loving him right. I see a family trying to figure out how to be together in a way that honors all of who you are." The accuracy of Eddie's assessment took Marcus's breath away. In 3 sentences, this man had captured the essential struggle of their family with more clarity than 2 years of therapy sessions. "How do you know that?" Rebecca asked. Eddie smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Mom, when you've lost everything you thought mattered, you get pretty good at seeing what actually does matter. Your family is trying to heal, and healing doesn't happen by pretending the wounds don't exist." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that he was in the presence of someone who understood loss in ways that money could never teach. "You said yesterday that you lost your son." "Jeremy, yes, sir. Can you tell us about him?" Eddie was quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if he had overstepped, but then the older man began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of memory and love. "Jeremy was born with what they called oppositional defiant disorder. Smart as a whip, but couldn't sit still, couldn't follow rules that didn't make sense to him, couldn't pretend to be someone he wasn't. The schools wanted to medicate him, therapists wanted to modify his behavior. Everyone had a plan to fix what they saw as broken." Daniel had moved closer during Eddie's story, drawn by the emotional honesty in his voice. He was now sitting directly in front of Eddie, still not making eye contact but clearly engaged. "What did you do?" Rebecca asked. "For too long I tried to make him fit, tried to teach him to be quieter, more compliant, more like what I thought a son should be, and every time I did that, I saw a little bit more of his light go out." Eddie's voice caught, and Marcus felt an answering tightness in his own throat. This was the conversation he had never known he needed to have with a man who had walked the path of loving a different kind of child and lived to tell about the mistakes. "When did things change?" Marcus asked. "The day Jeremy enlisted. He was 18, angry at the world and especially angry at me. He told me he was joining the Marines to prove he wasn't broken, that he could follow rules and be part of something bigger than himself. I was terrified, but I also saw something in his eyes that had been missing for years. Hope." Eddie pulled out the worn photograph again, handling it with the reverence reserved for holy relics. "The Marines didn't try to fix Jeremy. They gave him structure that made sense, challenges that used his intensity instead of fighting it, a brotherhood that valued his fierce loyalty. For the first time in his life, being exactly who he was made him valuable instead of problematic. And he thrived," Rebecca said softly. "He became the man I always knew he could be, once I stopped trying to make him into someone else." Eddie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. His last letter home, he told me he finally understood why God made him different, said his ADHD and his stubbornness and his inability to follow stupid rules made him a better Marine, a better leader, a better protector of people who couldn't protect themselves. Marcus felt the story settling into his bones, changing the shape of his understanding. What happened to him? IED outside of Kabul. He was leading a convoy to deliver supplies to a school. Jeremy always said his job was to make sure everyone got home safe. Eddie's voice broke slightly. "He saved 11 people that day. died making sure a bunch of kids he'd never met would have books and pencils and a chance at a future. The silence that followed was sacred, heavy with the weight of sacrifice and love. Daniel had moved even closer to Eddie, his small hand reaching out to touch the photograph with gentle curiosity. "That's my Jeremy," Eddie said to Daniel. "He would have liked you. He always said the best people were the ones who saw the world differently." Daniel looked up at Eddie for just a moment, the briefest flash of eye contact that felt like a benediction. Then he began to hum again, that simple melody that seemed to bridge the gap between past and present, between loss and hope. "Mr. Peterson," Marcus said, "I have a proposition for you." Eddie raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. My wife and I have been struggling to understand our son, to give him what he needs to thrive. Watching you with him yesterday and today, it's clear that you have something we lack. Not just patience or wisdom, but the ability to see Daniel for who he is instead of who we think he should be." Rebecca picked up the thread. "We'd like to offer you a job, not as a therapist or a tutor, but as, I guess the closest word would be mentor. Someone who can help us learn to see our son the way you do." Eddie's weathered face went through a complex series of expressions: surprise, gratitude, wariness, and something that might have been fear. "Folks, I appreciate the kindness, but I'm not exactly employee material. No address, no references, no qualifications, except failure and loss. Those might be exactly the qualifications we need," Marcus said, surprising himself with the truth of it. "Eddie, you've done something in 2 days that teams of professionals haven't managed in 2 years. You've helped our son feel safe being himself. Besides," Rebecca added with a smile, "failure and loss are qualifications we understand. We've been failing at parenting Daniel since his diagnosis. Maybe we need someone who knows what failure looks like to help us find our way to success." Eddie looked at Daniel, who was now arranging small pebbles in a precise pattern on the ground, completely absorbed in his task, but clearly content in their presence. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus had been thinking about this since yesterday, an idea taking shape that felt both crazy and inevitable. "We have a guest house on our property. It's been empty for 2 years, just sitting there like a monument to good intentions. You could live there, help us understand Daniel, maybe help Daniel understand himself. In exchange for what? In exchange for teaching us how to be the family Jeremy would have wanted us to be," Marcus said, and knew as he spoke that he had found the heart of what he was really asking for. Eddie was quiet for a long time, studying the water with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing past its surface to something deeper. Finally, he spoke. "I've been homeless for 3 years, since Jeremy died, and I couldn't figure out how to live in a world that didn't have him in it. I've gotten comfortable with not belonging anywhere, not being responsible for anyone's well-being but my own." Marcus felt his heart sink, preparing for rejection. "But," Eddie continued, "Jeremy always said that sometimes the thing you're most afraid of is exactly the thing you most need to do. And I've been afraid of caring about another child, afraid of failing another family the way I failed him." "How did you fail him?" Rebecca asked gently. "By taking so long to learn how to love him for who he was, instead of who I wanted him to be. By waiting until he was grown to tell him that his differences were gifts instead of problems to solve." Eddie looked at Daniel, then at Marcus and Rebecca, his eyes carrying decades of hard-won wisdom. "If you're serious about this, if you really want to learn how to see your son clearly, then I'll try, but not as an employee, as a friend, as someone who understands what it means to love a child who doesn't fit the world's expectations." "What would that look like?" Marcus asked. "It means you stop trying to fix Daniel and start trying to understand him. It means you learn to celebrate the things that make him different instead of mourning the things that make him difficult. It means you trust that he's exactly who he's supposed to be, even when that doesn't match your plans." Rebecca reached for Marcus's hand, squeezing it with a strength that felt like hope. "When can you start?" Eddie laughed, a sound that carried more joy than Marcus had heard from him yet. "Mom, I've been carrying my entire life in a shopping cart for 3 years. I can..." Start whenever you want." Daniel looked up from his pebble arrangement, and for a moment, Marcus could swear his son was smiling. Not the social smile that therapists had taught him to perform, but something real and spontaneous and beautiful. "Tomorrow," Marcus said. "Let's start tomorrow." As they walked back to their cars, Daniel between his parents and Eddie pushing his cart alongside them, Marcus realized that he was about to do something that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He was going to bring a homeless stranger into his family's life, not as hired help, but as a guide to understanding his own son. The business part of his mind catalogued all the reasons this was a terrible idea: liability issues, background checks, what the neighbors would think, what his business associates would say. But a deeper part of him, a part that had been sleeping for years, whispered that this was the most important decision he had ever made. "Eddie!" he called out as they reached the parking area. "Yes, sir. Thank you for seeing our son when we couldn't see him ourselves." Eddie stopped walking and turned to face Marcus fully. "Mr. Whitfield, your son doesn't need to be seen differently. He needs to be loved exactly as he is. There's a difference, and learning that difference is going to change your whole family." That night, after Daniel was settled in his room with his new stone and his familiar bedtime routines, Marcus and Rebecca sat on their living room couch and tried to process what they had just committed to doing. "Are we crazy?" Rebecca asked, voicing the question they were both thinking. "Probably," Marcus replied, "but we've been trying sane for 2 years, and it hasn't been working." Rebecca curled up against his side, something she hadn't done in months. "What do you think Eddie meant about loving Daniel exactly as he is?" Marcus thought about his son's face when Eddie had given him the stone, about the peace that had settled over Daniel in the presence of someone who asked nothing of him except to be himself. "I think it means we stop treating his autism like a disease and start treating it like a difference. That sounds simple, but it feels impossible." "Most important things do," Marcus said, and realized he was quoting something Eddie had said earlier that he hadn't consciously registered at the time. The next morning, Marcus did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He called in late to work. He wanted to be there when Eddie arrived, wanted to help him settle into the guest house, wanted to start learning how to be the father Daniel needed instead of the father he had planned to be. The guest house sat at the back of their property, a small but well-appointed space that Marcus had originally built for Rebecca's mother. But Rebecca's mother had never visited, put off by Daniel's diagnosis and the disruption his meltdowns brought to her orderly world. The space had become a symbol of good intentions and failed connections, furnished but empty, waiting for purpose. Marcus found himself nervous as he prepared the space, checking that the heat worked, that there were fresh linens, that the small kitchen was stocked with basics. He had hired and fired dozens of employees over the years, but this felt different. This felt like inviting grace into his life and praying he was worthy of it. Eddie arrived at 10 o'clock, pushing his cart up the long driveway with the same unhurried pace that seemed to characterize everything he did. He stopped when he saw the guest house, his expression cycling through surprise and something that might have been overwhelm. "This is where you want me to stay?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "If you're comfortable with it," Marcus replied. "I know it's probably more space than you're used to." Eddie laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mr. Whitfield, I've been sleeping in doorways and under bridges for 3 years. This is more than comfortable, it's overwhelming." Marcus felt a stab of something that might have been shame. Here he was, offering Eddie what amounted to luxury housing while the man had been surviving on the streets, and he was worried about whether it was nice enough. "We can make adjustments if you need something different." "No, sir, it's perfect. It's just..." Eddie trailed off, looking at the small house with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. "I haven't had a key to anything in a long time. Forgot what it felt like to have a place that was mine, even temporarily." They spent the morning helping Eddie settle in, a process that involved far less than Marcus had expected. 3 years of homelessness had taught Eddie to live with almost nothing, and his possessions fit easily into the small dresser and closet. The most space was taken up by books, worn paperbacks on philosophy, child development, and military history that Eddie unpacked with careful reverence. "You read a lot," Marcus observed, trying to make conversation as Eddie arranged his small library. "When you don't have a television or internet, books become your entertainment, your education, and your escape," Eddie replied. "Plus, Jeremy always said that reading was the best way to understand people different from yourself." Marcus picked up one of the books, a dog-eared copy of The Reason I Jump by Naoki Higashida. "What's this one about?" "It's written by a 13-year-old boy with autism, explaining what his world feels like from the inside. Changed everything I thought I knew about how different minds work." Eddie took the book gently, handling it like a precious artifact. "Might be worth reading if you want to understand what Daniel experiences." The suggestion was made casually, but Marcus heard the deeper challenge in it. How many books had he read about autism? How much time had he spent trying to understand his son's inner world versus trying to change it? "I'd like to borrow it when you're finished." Eddie smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "It's yours to keep. I've got it memorized by now." Around noon, Rebecca brought Daniel out to meet Eddie at the guest house. Daniel approached cautiously, clearly remembering Eddie but uncertain about this new context. The guest house was part of his familiar territory, but Eddie's presence there created a new dynamic that required careful navigation. "Hey there, Daniel," Eddie said from the porch steps, not moving toward the boy, but making his presence available. "Want to see something interesting?" Daniel's head tilted slightly, his version of curiosity, and he took a few steps closer. Eddie reached into his pocket and pulled out a small kaleidoscope, the kind sold in museum gift shops. "Found this at a yard sale yesterday. The lady said it was broken because the picture doesn't stay." "The same, but I think that might be exactly what makes it work." He held the kaleidoscope out, not toward Daniel, but up to his own eye, demonstrating its use. "Every time you turn it, everything changes, but it's still beautiful. Sometimes the same pieces make something completely new." Daniel's interest was clearly engaged now. He moved closer, his body language shifting from wary to curious. When Eddie offered him the kaleidoscope, Daniel took it with the careful deliberation he applied to all new experiences. Marcus and Rebecca watched from a distance as their son explored this simple toy, turning it slowly and making small sounds of fascination at each new pattern. It was the kind of sustained, joyful engagement they rarely saw from him, and it was happening because Eddie had understood something about Daniel that they had missed. His love of patterns, of things that changed in predictable but surprising ways. "How did you know he would like that?" Rebecca asked. "He spent yesterday arranging pebbles in patterns," Eddie replied. "Seemed like a boy who appreciated the way small things could come together to make something beautiful." Marcus felt that familiar twist in his chest, the recognition that Eddie was seeing their son with clarity that eluded his own father. But instead of the usual frustration, he felt something different, gratitude for having found someone who could teach him to see what he had been missing. Eddie, Marcus, said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest." "All right. What do you see when you look at our family? Not just Daniel, but all of us." Eddie was quiet for a moment, watching Daniel with the kaleidoscope. "I see a family that loves each other but doesn't know how to show it in ways everyone can understand. I see parents who are grieving the child they expected and haven't figured out how to celebrate the child they have. I see a boy who experiences love differently than most people express it, which makes everyone feel like they're failing." The assessment was gentle but devastating in its accuracy. Marcus felt exposed, seen in ways that were both uncomfortable and necessary. "What do we do about it?" "You learn a new language," Eddie said simply. "Daniel speaks love in his own dialect, through patterns and routines and small gestures and quiet presence. You've been trying to teach him to speak your language instead of learning to speak his." Rebecca moved closer to Daniel, sitting on the ground near him but not crowding his space. What would speaking his language look like? Eddie smiled at the question. Watch him, really watch him. See what brings him joy, what calms him, what makes him feel safe. Then do more of those things, not because they'll change him, but because they honor who he is. For the next hour, they did exactly that. They watched Daniel with the kaleidoscope, noting how he turned it in, specific increments, how he made soft humming sounds when a pattern particularly pleased him, how he naturally shared the experience by tilting the kaleidoscope so others could see what he was seeing. He's trying to show us what he finds beautiful, Rebecca said with wonder. He's been doing that all along, Eddie replied. You just needed someone to help you recognize the invitation. Marcus knelt beside his son, accepting the kaleidoscope when Daniel offered it. Through the lens, fragments of colored glass arranged themselves into temporary mandalas, each turn revealing new possibilities from the same elements. It was, he realized, a perfect metaphor for their family. The same people, the same love, but infinite ways to see the beauty in their unique configuration. Thank you, he said to Daniel, not sure if his son would understand the gratitude, but needing to express it anyway. Daniel looked at him, not full eye contact, but a glance that felt like acknowledgement, and began to hum that melody again. But this time Marcus recognized it. It was Edelweiss, the song from The Sound of Music that Rebecca used to sing to Daniel as a baby. Somehow, Eddie had intuited a melody that connected to their family's early joy, and Daniel had made it his own. That afternoon, while Daniel napped and Rebecca caught up on work calls, Marcus found himself sitting on Eddie's porch, trying to process the morning's revelations. He had built his life around the belief that problems existed to be solved, that enough money and effort could overcome any obstacle. But Daniel wasn't a problem to solve. He was a person to understand, and understanding required a completely different skill set. Penny for your thoughts, Eddie said, settling into the chair beside him. I'm realizing how much time I've wasted, Marcus replied. 2 years of trying to fix something that wasn't broken, while missing out on getting to know the remarkable little boy right in front of me. Time's not wasted if it leads you where you need to be, Eddie said gently. Jeremy used to tell me that mistakes were just expensive education. You've been learning what doesn't work, so you could recognize what does. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled to the notes he'd been taking throughout the morning. Observations about Daniel's preferences, Eddie's insights, questions to research later. His business training had kicked in automatically, turning understanding into action items. What's that? Eddie asked, noticing the phone. Notes. Things I want to remember, follow up on. I know it probably seems clinical, but it's how I process information. Eddie studied the screen, reading Marcus's careful documentation of Daniel's behaviors and responses. You know what I see here? Excessive planning? Love learning to speak a new language. Eddie's voice carried approval rather than judgment. This isn't clinical, Marcus. This is a father figuring out how to father his son. Use whatever tools work for you. Just remember that Daniel is the expert on Daniel, not any book or theory or professional. The validation felt like absolution. Marcus had been so afraid of approaching his son wrong that he had barely approached him at all. But maybe his analytical nature didn't have to be a barrier to connection. Maybe it could be a bridge if he used it to understand rather than to control. Eddie, can I ask you something personal? Shoot. How did you end up homeless? I mean, you clearly have education, wisdom, life skills. What happened? Eddie was quiet for so long that Marcus wondered if he had overstepped. But finally, the older man began to speak. After Jeremy died, I couldn't function, couldn't work, couldn't sleep, couldn't figure out how to live in a world that kept going like nothing had changed. I was a construction foreman for 20 years, good at my job, good with people. But grief doesn't care about your qualifications. Marcus waited, sensing there was more. I started drinking, not heavily at first, just enough to sleep. Enough to quiet the voices that kept telling me I should have saved him somehow. Lost my job, then my apartment, then my truck. By the time I realized what was happening, I was too proud to ask for help and too broken to help myself. What changed? Eddie pulled out a letter, creased and worn from countless readings. This came about 6 months ago, from one of Jeremy's Marine buddies, a kid named Rodriguez, who Jeremy had mentored. He told me about how Jeremy used to talk about his dad, about how much he loved me even when I was making mistakes, about how he wanted to make me proud. Marcus felt his throat tighten as Eddie's voice broke slightly. Rodriguez said Jeremy never blamed me for taking time to learn how to love him right. Said Jeremy always knew I was doing my best with what I understood at the time. Reading that letter, I realized I had been honoring Jeremy's death, but not his life. He wouldn't have wanted me to give up on everything he had loved about this world. So you stopped drinking? I got sober, yes. But more than that, I started looking for ways to love the things Jeremy had loved. Kids who were different, families who were struggling, people who needed someone to see their worth when they couldn't see it themselves. Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place. That's why you were at the park. I volunteer there sometimes, help the groundskeepers, keep an eye on the kids. Figured if I couldn't save my own son, maybe I could help other people's children feel safe and valued. The selflessness of it took Marcus's breath away. Eddie had lost everything, including his child, and his response had been to find ways to serve other people's children. It was the opposite of Marcus's own response to difficulty, where Marcus withdrew into work and control. Eddie had opened himself to vulnerability and service. That's why this matters so much to you, Marcus said, helping us understand Daniel, partly, but also because I see what Jeremy would have seen in your family. Incredible love that just needs translation. Parents who would do anything for their child if they just knew what anything looked like. That evening, the Whitfield family had dinner together for the first time in months. Usually, Daniel's sensory sensitivities made family meals a battleground of negotiations and accommodations, but Eddie had suggested they eat on the back porch, with Daniel positioned so he could see both the garden and the house, giving him visual anchors and escape routes that made the social demands of dinner feel manageable. Eddie joined them, but instead of trying to engage Daniel in conversation, he simply provided a calm presence and occasionally shared observations about the birds in the garden or the way the evening light changed the color of the trees. His commentary wasn't directed at anyone in particular, which meant Daniel could engage with it or ignore it without social pressure. The Mockingbird by the Roses has learned 3 new songs this week, Eddie mentioned casually. Must have some new neighbors to copy. Daniel's head turned toward the garden, his attention caught by the mention of patterns and learning, concepts that resonated with his love of understanding how things worked. The birds are excellent teachers, Eddie continued. They show us that learning never stops, that you can be yourself while still picking up new skills from the world around you. Marcus realized that Eddie was doing something remarkable. He was having a conversation with Daniel without requiring Daniel to participate in conventional ways. Daniel was learning that his presence was valued, that his attention was welcome, that he could be part of the family dynamic without having to perform social behaviors that felt unnatural to him. Daniel, Rebecca said softly, would you like to show Eddie your rock collection? Daniel's rock collection was one of his most prized possessions. Dozens of stones arranged by size, color, and texture in carefully organized displays throughout his room. He rarely shared it with others, protective of both the collection itself and the complex organizational system that made sense only to him. But Daniel stood up from the table and looked toward the house, then back at Eddie. It wasn't a verbal invitation, but it was clearly an invitation nonetheless. I'd be honored to see your rocks, Eddie said, standing with the same unhurried movement that characterized all his interactions with Daniel. Marcus and Rebecca followed at a distance as Daniel led Eddie to his room, watching their son navigate the complex social task of sharing something precious with someone new. Daniel's room was a carefully organized space, where every object had its place and purpose. The rock collection occupied an entire wall, arranged on floating shelves that Marcus had installed according to Daniel's precise specifications. Eddie approached the display with the kind of reverence usually reserved for museums. He didn't touch anything, didn't ask questions that required answers, just allowed himself to appreciate the beauty and complexity of Daniel's organizational system. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "You've created something that shows how different beautiful things can work together when they're arranged with care and attention." Daniel moved to one section of the display and picked up a single stone, smooth and black, with white veining that looked like lightning frozen in rock. He held it out to Eddie, the gesture so unexpected that Rebecca gasped softly. "Are you sure?" Eddie asked, understanding the magnitude of what was being offered. "This looks very special." Daniel nodded, pressing the stone into Eddie's weathered palm. It was the first time Marcus had ever seen his son voluntarily give away part of his collection, and the generosity of it brought tears to his eyes. "I'll treasure this," Eddie said simply. "Thank you for trusting me with something so important to you." Daniel began to hum again, that same melody that had become the soundtrack to their unlikely friendship. But this time, Rebecca joined in, her voice blending with her son's in a harmony that felt like healing. Later that night, after Daniel was settled in his room and Eddie had returned to the guest house, Marcus and Rebecca sat in their living room trying to process the day's transformations. "It's like watching someone wake up our son," Rebecca said, curled against Marcus's side. "Not change him, but help him feel safe enough to show us who he's always been." Marcus thought about the stone Daniel had given Eddie, about the trust implicit in that gesture, about the way his son had navigated social interaction when it was offered without pressure or expectation. "I keep thinking about what Eddie said, about learning Daniel's language instead of trying to teach him ours. What do you think that looks like practically? I mean, we can't restructure the whole world to accommodate his sensitivities. Maybe we don't need to restructure the world," Marcus said slowly. "But we can restructure our piece of it. We can make our home, our family, our daily interactions places where Daniel can be himself without having to work so hard to be something else." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "That sounds simple, but it feels like it requires completely changing how we think about parenting." "Maybe it does. Maybe traditional parenting advice doesn't apply to a child who experiences the world differently. Maybe we need to become different kinds of parents." The next morning brought their first real test. Daniel had a scheduled appointment with Dr. Morrison, his regular therapist, and Marcus had decided to attend for the first time in months. He wanted to share what they had learned from Eddie, to see if the clinical world could incorporate the insights that had emerged from their unlikely mentorship. Dr. Morrison's office was designed to be calming, soft colors, comfortable furniture, toys and tools arranged to invite engagement. Daniel had been coming here twice a week for 8 months, working on social skills, communication strategies, and behavioral modifications. The sessions were expensive, evidence-based, and largely ineffective at creating the kind of organic connection Marcus had witnessed between Daniel and Eddie. "It's wonderful that you're here, Marcus," Dr. Morrison said as they settled into the familiar routine. "Daniel, shall we start with our greeting practice today?" Daniel's body immediately tensed, his shoulders rising toward his ears in the defensive posture that Marcus now recognized as preparation for social demands that felt overwhelming. Dr. Morrison began the familiar coaching, encouraging eye contact, prompting verbal responses, shaping behaviors toward neurotypical norms. Marcus watched his son comply with the exercises, but he could see the effort it required, the way Daniel's natural curiosity and joy dimmed under the pressure to perform social behaviors that didn't come naturally. It was like watching someone forced to write with their non-dominant hand, technically possible, but exhausting and inefficient. "Dr. Morrison," Marcus interrupted gently, "could we try something different today?" The therapist looked surprised. "Of course. What did you have in mind?" Marcus thought about Eddie's approach, about the way he had created space for Daniel to be himself, rather than demanding that Daniel become someone else. What if we focused on understanding how Daniel naturally communicates instead of trying to change how he communicates? I'm not sure I follow. Marcus felt suddenly protective of his son, seeing him through Eddie's eyes instead of through the lens of deficiency that had colored his perception for so long. Daniel has been showing us all along how he connects with people through shared interests, parallel activities, offering meaningful objects. What if we honored those natural communication styles instead of trying to replace them? Dr. Morrison's expression shifted subtly, and Marcus could see her professional training warring with genuine consideration of his suggestion. Marcus, the research is very clear that early intervention focused on social skills development leads to better long-term outcomes. Better according to whose definition? Marcus asked, surprising himself with the sharpness in his voice. Daniel gave a precious stone to a friend yesterday, shared his most valued possessions, showed joy and connection and generosity. That's not a deficit. That's a different way of expressing love. Daniel had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, caught between his father's advocacy and his therapist's expectations. Marcus could see the stress building in his son's body language and made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week ago. We're going to take a break from today's session, he announced, standing up. Daniel, would you like to go to the park? Dr. Morrison looked shocked. Marcus, we've made significant progress with Daniel's program. Interrupting his routine is stressing him out, Marcus replied firmly. We're going to try something different for a while. As they left the office, Daniel's relief was palpable. His shoulders dropped, his breathing slowed, and he began to hum softly, signs that he was returning to his natural state instead of the performed compliance that therapy had required. Where are we going? Rebecca asked as they walked to the car. To find Eddie, Marcus said. I want to see what Daniel looks like when he's learning from someone who doesn't think he needs to be fixed. They found Eddie at Lincoln Park, sitting on their usual bench and feeding breadcrumbs to a family of ducks. Daniel spotted him from across the playground and began moving in his direction with more purpose and enthusiasm than Marcus had seen from him in any therapeutic setting. Well, hello there, Eddie said as Daniel approached. Perfect timing. I was just having a very interesting conversation with these ducks about the importance of patience. Daniel settled beside Eddie on the bench, pulling the black and white stone Eddie had given him from his pocket. He turned it over in his hands, the repetitive motion clearly soothing. You know what I realized about that stone today? Eddie said conversationally. It's been on a long journey to get here, probably started as part of a mountain somewhere, got worn down by weather and water, rolled along riverbeds for thousands of years, just waiting for the right person to find it and understand its value. Marcus felt the metaphor settle into his chest. Daniel was like that stone, shaped by forces beyond his control, beautiful in his uniqueness, waiting for people who could see his value instead of trying to reshape him into something more conventional. Sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that took the longest path to get where they belong, Eddie continued. Wouldn't be nearly as interesting if everything was quick and easy and exactly the same. Daniel looked up at Eddie, and for a moment Marcus could swear he saw understanding pass between them, not the kind that required words, but the deeper recognition of being truly seen by another person. Eddie, Rebecca said, settling onto the grass near the bench. We just came from Daniel's therapy appointment. How did that go? Marcus and Rebecca exchanged a look. We realized that we've been asking the wrong questions, Marcus said. Instead of asking how to help Daniel fit into the world, maybe we should be asking how to help the world make space for Daniel. Eddie smiled, the expression carrying pride and something that looked like relief. That's a much better question. What made you realize that? Watching him with you, Rebecca admitted. Seeing how he responds when someone accepts him instead of trying to change him. The connection is immediate and real and joyful. That's what we want for him, not perfect social skills, but genuine connection. So what's the plan? Marcus felt a familiar stirring, the same energy that had driven him to build his business empire. But this time, instead of conquering markets, he wanted to create something more meaningful, a life where his son could thrive as himself. "We're going to change everything," he said, the words carrying the weight of decision. "The therapy approach, the school situation, the way we structure our family life. We're going to build a world where Daniel doesn't have to pretend to be someone else to be loved." Eddie's eyes crinkled with approval. "That's ambitious. Also exactly what Jeremy would have told you to do." Over the next week, Marcus threw himself into this new project with the same intensity he had once reserved for business deals. But instead of contracts and negotiations, he was researching alternative education approaches, connecting with families who had chosen different paths, and learning about the neurodiversity movement that celebrated rather than pathologized different ways of thinking. The more he learned, the more he realized how much energy they had been wasting trying to force Daniel into systems that weren't designed for him. Traditional school, conventional therapy, standard social expectations, all of it assumed that there was one right way to be human, and anything different needed correction. "What if we homeschooled him?" Marcus suggested one evening as he and Rebecca reviewed their options. "You mean hire tutors?" "No, I mean we actually teach him ourselves. With Eddie's help, we could create a learning environment that works with his interests and strengths instead of against them." Rebecca looked skeptical. "Marcus, we both work full-time. When would we have time to homeschool?" "I've been thinking about that too," Marcus said, pulling out the notes he had been compiling. "What if I restructured my role at the company, stepped back from day-to-day operations, focused on strategic oversight that I could do from home? We have good people running the divisions. They don't need me micromanaging every decision." The suggestion hung in the air between them, radical in its implications. Marcus had never voluntarily stepped away from control of anything, let alone the business that had defined his identity for 15 years. "You would do that?" Rebecca asked. "For Daniel, for our family." In a heartbeat, Marcus realized as he spoke that it was true. Somewhere in the past week, his priorities had undergone a fundamental reordering. What's the point of building wealth if I don't have time to enjoy the family it's supposed to support? Rebecca moved closer to him on the couch, her hand finding his. What about my practice? I can't exactly work from home. Therapy requires in-person presence. What if you reduced your client load, kept the cases you're most passionate about, referred the others to colleagues? We don't need both of us working full-time to maintain our lifestyle, especially if we're not paying for expensive therapies and private schools. They spent the evening sketching out possibilities, imagining a life structured around their family's actual needs instead of external expectations. It felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating, a chance to start over with wisdom they hadn't possessed 3 years ago. There's something else I want to discuss, Marcus said as they prepared for bed. I've been thinking about Eddie's situation, about the fact that he's been homeless for 3 years. What about it? I did some research today into that affordable housing project my company was asked to invest in. Peterson Development, same last name as Eddie, which got me curious. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. And? It's a legitimate operation, but they're focused on temporary solutions, shelters, transitional housing, programs that move people through systems rather than addressing root causes. They're not actually reducing homelessness so much as managing it. What does that have to do with Eddie? Marcus pulled out his laptop, showing Rebecca the research he had compiled. What if we could do something different? Not just manage the problem, but actually solve it for real people. Eddie told me there are dozens of homeless veterans in Seattle, people with skills and experience who just need a chance to rebuild. Marcus, what are you thinking? I'm thinking about buying that development project and restructuring it. Instead of temporary housing, what if we created permanent supportive housing? Places where people like Eddie could live with dignity while they rebuilt their lives, with job training and mental health support and community connections. Rebecca stared at him, processing the implications. You want to completely change your business model. I want to use our resources to solve problems that matter instead of just accumulating more wealth we don't need. Marcus closed the laptop, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. Eddie changed our family by seeing value where others saw problems. What if we could do that on a larger scale? The next morning, Marcus called his executive team and announced that he was restructuring his role at Whitfield Industries. The decision sent shockwaves through the company. Marcus had never shown interest in anything but aggressive expansion and maximum profits. His announcement that he wanted to pivot towards socially responsible investments was met with confusion and resistance. "Sir," his CFO Sarah Thompson said during the emergency meeting he had called, "the Peterson Development Project has a much lower ROI than our traditional investments. From a purely financial standpoint." "I'm not looking at this from a purely financial standpoint anymore," Marcus interrupted. "I'm looking at it from a human impact standpoint." His business partners exchanged worried glances. In their world, human impact was a nice talking point for marketing materials, not a driving force for investment decisions. "Marcus," his longtime partner David Chen said carefully, "is everything all right? This is a pretty dramatic shift from your usual approach." Marcus thought about how to explain that watching a homeless man connect with his autistic son had fundamentally altered his understanding of what success meant. "Everything is more right than it's been in years, David. I've just realized that building wealth without building meaning is a waste of everyone's time." He outlined his vision for the Peterson Development Project, not just affordable housing, but a comprehensive support system that addressed the complex factors that led to homelessness. Job training programs, mental health services, community gardens, childcare support, financial literacy classes, a model that treated homeless individuals as whole people with varied needs rather than just problems to warehouse. "The initial investment is higher," Marcus acknowledged, "but the long-term community impact could transform how we approach social problems. And frankly, we have enough money. It's time to see if we can use it to make a difference that matters." The meeting ended with reluctant agreement to explore the proposal, though Marcus could see that his team thought he was having some kind of midlife crisis. Maybe he was, but if so, it was the best crisis he had ever experienced. That afternoon, he found Eddie in the guest house, reading one of his worn philosophy books, while Daniel played quietly nearby with his kaleidoscope. The scene struck Marcus as perfect in its simplicity. Two people comfortable in each other's presence, no pressure to perform or entertain, just the peaceful coexistence that Daniel thrived in. "Eddie, can we talk about something?" "Of course." Marcus settled into the chair across from Eddie, Daniel still within their circle but absorbed in his own activity. "I want to ask you about something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "All right. If you had unlimited resources to address homelessness in Seattle, what would you do?" Eddie set down his book, giving Marcus his full attention. "That's a big question. I'm serious. Imagine money wasn't an obstacle, that you could design a system from scratch to actually solve the problem instead of just managing it." Eddie was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see him thinking through the implications of the question. "You're talking about the Peterson Development Project, aren't you?" Marcus felt his eyebrows rise. "How did you know about that?" "Peterson Development is run by my nephew, David Peterson, Jeremy's cousin. He's been trying to get funding for his housing project for 2 years." The coincidence was so perfect that Marcus almost laughed. "Your nephew? David's a good kid, has his heart in the right place, but he's young, doesn't understand yet that housing is just the beginning. You can't solve homelessness by just giving people apartments. You have to address the underlying issues that led to housing insecurity in the first place." "What kind of underlying issues?" Eddie leaned forward, his passion for the subject evident. "Mental health support, job training that leads to actual employment, financial literacy, substance abuse treatment, community connections. Most homeless people aren't homeless because they're lazy or worthless. They're homeless because they experienced trauma or loss or economic disaster and didn't have adequate support systems to help them recover. Marcus pulled out his notebook, writing quickly as Eddie continued. You need wraparound services, but more than that, you need to treat people with dignity. Most programs for homeless people are designed to be temporary, to move people through the system as quickly as possible. That creates instability and stress that makes it harder to address underlying problems. What would permanent supportive housing look like? Apartments that people could call home for as long as they needed, with services available but not mandatory. Job training programs that connected to actual employment opportunities. Mental health support that recognized trauma and grief as normal human responses to abnormal circumstances. Community spaces where people could connect with each other and rebuild social networks. Eddie paused, studying Marcus's face. Why are you asking me this? Because I want to fund it. All of it. Not as charity, but as an investment in proving that comprehensive solutions work better than band-aid approaches. Eddie's weathered face went through a complex series of expressions: surprise, hope, wariness, and something that might have been grief. Mr. Whitfield, that's a beautiful idea, but comprehensive solutions are expensive. David's been trying to get funding for basic housing for 2 years. Eddie, I make more money in a quarter than most people see in a lifetime. What's the point of having that wealth if I don't use it to solve problems that matter? Because most wealthy people talk about solving problems, but what they really want is to feel good about themselves without actually changing anything. Fundamental. The challenge in Eddie's voice was clear, and Marcus felt it settle into his chest like a test. What would convince you that I'm serious about this? Put your money where your mouth is. Buy the Peterson Development Project, hire David to run it, and let him design the program without interference from investors who think they know better than the people they're trying to help. Marcus felt a familiar thrill, the same energy that had driven him to build his business empire, but this time, instead of conquering markets, he was being challenged to solve a problem that mattered. What would you want your role to be in something like this? Me? Eddie looked surprised. Mr. Whitfield, I'm not qualified to run social programs. You're qualified to understand what homeless people need because you've been homeless. You're qualified to see potential in people that others overlook because you've learned to see Daniel clearly when professionals couldn't. You're qualified to design programs that treat people with dignity because you know what it feels like to be invisible. Eddie was quiet for a long time, and Marcus could see him wrestling with something deeper than professional uncertainty. I've been living on the margins for 3 years, Mr. Whitfield. I'm not sure I remember how to be responsible for anything bigger than my own survival. Then this would be a chance to remember. Jeremy would want you to use everything you've learned, including the hard lessons, to help other people find their way home. The mention of his son broke something open in Eddie's face, and Marcus saw the man he had been before grief and loss had stripped away everything he thought he was. If we did this, Eddie said slowly, if we really tried to solve homelessness instead of just managing it, it would change everything about how the city approaches social problems. Good, Marcus replied. Maybe it's time for everything to change. That evening, the Whitfield family had dinner on the back porch again. But this time, the conversation was different. Instead of careful navigation around difficult topics, they were planning a future that felt both ambitious and possible. So, let me understand this, Rebecca said, serving Daniel his favorite pasta while he arranged his food in precise geometric patterns. You want to restructure your entire business model, redesign how we educate Daniel, and solve homelessness in Seattle? When you put it like that, it sounds overwhelming, Marcus admitted. But each piece connects to the others. We learn to honor Daniel's differences, which teaches us to see value in all kinds of human diversity, which leads us to create systems that work for people, instead of forcing people to work for systems. Daniel looked up from his food arrangement, drawn by the emotion in his father's voice. He studied Marcus's face with the kind of focused attention that meant he was processing something important. "Daddy," Daniel said suddenly, the word clear and intentional. It was the first time he had addressed Marcus directly in months, and the sound of it stopped all conversation at the table. "Yes, buddy." Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the smooth stone Eddie had given him. He held it out to Marcus, offering the same gift of trust he had given Eddie days before. Marcus accepted the stone with shaking hands, understanding the magnitude of what was being offered. Daniel was sharing something precious with him, trusting him with a token of their growing connection. "Thank you, Daniel," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll take very good care of this." Daniel smiled, not the practiced social smile that therapists had taught him, but something genuine and spontaneous that transformed his entire face. Then he began to hum that familiar melody, and this time, both his parents joined in, creating a harmony that felt like coming home. Eddie watched this scene from his seat at the table, and Marcus could see tears gathering in the older man's weathered eyes. "You know what Jeremy would say if he could see this?" "What?" Rebecca asked softly. "He'd say that sometimes the most important journeys start with a single stone." 2 weeks later, Marcus stood in the conference room of Peterson Development, surrounded by architects, social workers, city planners, and community advocates. The transformation of the affordable housing project had attracted attention from across the city, not just because of the scale of investment, but because of the radical approach they were proposing. The traditional model treats homelessness as a housing problem, David Peterson was explaining to the assembled group, but housing is just one component of stability. Our approach recognizes that people need comprehensive support to rebuild their lives. David was 28, with the idealistic energy of someone who believed problems could be solved if you just applied enough creativity and determination. Marcus could see echoes of Eddie in the young man's face, the same combination of gentleness and strength that had made his uncle such an effective advocate for Daniel. "The key innovation," David continued, "is permanent supportive housing instead of transitional programs. When people know they have a stable place to call home, they can focus their energy on addressing underlying issues instead of constantly worrying about where they'll sleep next." Marcus watched Eddie during this presentation, seeing him process the reality of what they were creating. His nephew's vision was exactly what Eddie had described that day in the guest house. Wraparound services, dignity-based approach, community connections, long-term stability. "What about job training?" asked Sandra Williams, the city's director of social services. "We're partnering with local businesses to create training programs that lead directly to employment," Marcus answered. "Not just any employment, but jobs that pay living wages and offer advancement opportunities. The goal isn't to manage poverty, but to create pathways out of it." One of the city councilmen raised his hand. "Mr. Whitfield, this is an impressive proposal, but the cost is enormous. What's your expected return on investment?" Marcus felt the familiar tension that came with translating human values into economic language. The return is measured in lives rebuilt, families reunited, and community transformation. If you need financial justification, consider the cost savings from reduced emergency room visits, decreased police calls, lower incarceration rates, and increased tax revenue from people who move from dependence to self-sufficiency. But the real answer, the one he couldn't say in a business meeting, was simpler. The return was the ability to look his son in the eye and know that he was using his resources to create a world where everyone's value was recognized, where differences were honored instead of hidden, where no one had to choose between being themselves and being loved. After the meeting, Marcus found Eddie standing outside the building, looking up at the construction site where the first phase of housing would be built. "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked. "I'm thinking about Jeremy, about how proud he'd be to see what grew from his death. I'm thinking about all the people who will have homes because we learned to see value where others saw problems." Eddie's voice carried a mix of grief and hope that Marcus was beginning to recognize as the sound of healing. "I'm also thinking about how scared I am," Eddie continued. "It's been 3 years since I was responsible for anything bigger than my own survival. What if I fail? What if I can't do justice to the trust you're placing in me?" Marcus thought about his own fears, about changing his business model, about homeschooling Daniel, about stepping away from the control that had defined his identity for decades. Then we failed together, and we learn from it, and we try again. That's what families do. Families? Eddie, you've become part of our family. Not as an employee or a consultant, but as someone who helped us find our way home to each other. That makes you family. Eddie's weathered face cracked into a smile that reminded Marcus why. They were doing all of this because everyone deserved to be seen clearly, valued deeply, and loved exactly as they were. 6 months later, the Whitfield family looked almost unrecognizable from the people they had been when Marcus first spotted Eddie talking to Daniel on that park bench. Their house had been transformed into a learning environment designed around Daniel's interests and sensitivities. The formal dining room had become a science lab where Daniel could explore his fascination with patterns and systems. The living room was filled with books, art supplies, and musical instruments. The backyard had been converted into a garden where Daniel could observe the cycles and relationships that governed natural systems. Marcus had kept his promise to restructure his role at Whitfield Industries, moving from hands-on management to strategic oversight that he could accomplish in 20 hours a week instead of 60. The change had been terrifying. At first, his identity had been so tied to constant activity that he had forgotten how to exist without the adrenaline of perpetual crisis management. But learning to be present for Daniel's education had taught him a different kind of engagement. Instead of managing other people's work, he was discovering the joy of primary creation, developing curriculum that honored Daniel's learning style, documenting their educational journey, connecting with other families who had chosen alternative paths. "Dad, look at this!" Daniel called from the garden, where he was conducting his daily observation of the plants they had started from seeds. Marcus joined his son among the raised beds, kneeling beside him to examine whatever had captured Daniel's attention. Daniel was pointing to a tomato plant where tiny green fruits were just beginning to form. "The flowers turned into food," Daniel said with wonder, as if witnessing this transformation for the first time despite having observed it daily for weeks. "Pretty amazing, isn't it?" Marcus replied. "Same plant, but it keeps changing into something new while staying completely itself." Daniel looked at his father with an expression that suggested he understood the metaphor on some level beyond words. "Like Eddie." "What do you mean?" "Eddie is still Eddie, but he's different now. Happier, like the plant." Marcus felt his chest tighten with pride at his son's observation. Daniel was right. Eddie had undergone his own transformation over the past months, not changing who he was, but allowing himself to grow into the fullness of his potential. The Peterson Development Project had become Eddie's life's work, and he approached it with the same gentle intensity he brought to everything else. He had moved out of the guest house and into the first completed housing unit, wanting to experience the program from the perspective of the people they were serving. His apartment had become a gathering place for residents, a space where people could connect without formal programming or social service oversight. "Eddie's teaching other people how to see," Daniel continued, his observation cutting straight to the heart of what made Eddie special. "Like he taught you to see me." Marcus wrapped his arms around his son, marveling at the clarity of Daniel's insight. "You're absolutely right, buddy. Eddie taught me how to see what was always there." That evening, Rebecca returned from her reduced practice hours to find Marcus and Daniel building a complex structure out of wooden blocks in the living room. It wasn't the kind of random construction that most children engaged in. Daniel's building followed mathematical principles that created both beauty and structural integrity. "What are you making?" she asked, settling onto the floor beside them. "Daniel is showing me how patterns create strength," Marcus replied. Apparently, the most stable structures use repetition and variation in specific ratios. Oh, like music, Daniel added, connecting concepts across disciplines in the way that made him such a remarkable learner. Rebecca watched her husband and son work together, their heads bent over the shared project, their communication happening through gesture and demonstration as much as words. This was what she had dreamed of during those dark months when Marcus had been hiding in his office, and Daniel had been lost in therapeutic interventions that missed the point of who he was. "How was your day?" Marcus asked, not looking up from the blocks, but clearly tuned into his wife's presence. "Good. I had a session with a family whose daughter was just diagnosed with autism. They're scared, overwhelmed, asking all the same questions we used to ask." Marcus glanced up at that, reading the emotion in Rebecca's voice. "What did you tell them?" "I told them about Daniel, about what we learned from Eddie, about how the questions change. When you start seeing autism as a difference instead of a deficit." "How did they respond?" "They wanted to know if they could meet us, see what our life looks like now. They need hope that their daughter can be happy being herself instead of spending her life trying to be someone else." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that their family's journey might have value beyond their own healing. "What do you think about that?" "I think we have something to offer, not as experts, but as people who found their way from fear to acceptance, from trying to fix to learning to love." Daniel looked up from his building, his attention caught by the emotional intensity of his parents' conversation. "Can I show them my rocks?" "Of course, buddy," Rebecca said, understanding that Daniel was offering to share his most precious possessions with strangers who needed hope. "And the kaleidoscope?" "Absolutely." Daniel returned to his building with satisfaction, having settled the matter of how he would contribute to helping other families. Marcus marveled at his son's instinctive generosity, the way he naturally wanted to share the things that brought him joy with people who were struggling. A month later, the Whitfield home hosted its first family support gathering. 6 families with autistic children came together to share experiences, resources, and hope. Marcus had been nervous about opening their private space to strangers, but Daniel had insisted that people needed to see what their life actually looked like instead of just hearing about it. The gathering was unlike any social event Marcus had ever hosted. Instead of cocktails and small talk, they had stations set up around the house where children could engage with activities that honored different sensory needs and interests. Daniel moved through the space like a host, sharing his collections, demonstrating his favorite activities, showing other children that being themselves was not just acceptable, but valuable. "Your son is remarkable," said Maria Santos, whose 8-year-old daughter Carmen had spent most of the evening absorbed in Daniel's rock collection. Carmen has never connected with another child like this. Marcus watched Carmen and Daniel sitting side by side, not talking, but engaged in parallel play that felt deeply satisfying to both of them. Daniel's taught us that connection doesn't have to look like what we expected. Sometimes the deepest relationships happen in quiet spaces where people can just be themselves. Eddie had joined them for the gathering, sharing his perspective as someone who had learned to see value in differences through his own experiences of loss and rebuilding. He moved through the group with his characteristic gentleness, offering insights without judgment, helping parents recognize their children's strengths instead of focusing on their challenges. "The thing about kids like Daniel and Carmen," Eddie told Maria, "is that they experience the world with unusual intensity. That's not a problem to solve. That's a gift to nurture. The world needs people who notice things others miss, who care deeply about details, who see patterns and connections that escape the rest of us." By the end of the evening, the 6 families had formed a support network that would continue meeting monthly. But more than that, they had seen a model of what life could look like when families organized around their children's actual needs instead of external expectations. "Thank you," said Robert Kim, whose son Jason had spent the evening building increasingly complex structures with Daniel's blocks. "6 months ago, we thought our life was over. Tonight, we saw what beginning again could look like. After everyone left, Marcus and Rebecca cleaned up while Daniel arranged his collections, making sure everything was back in its proper place after being shared with new friends. "I think we need to formalize this," Rebecca said, carefully packing away the art supplies they had provided for the evening's activities. "What do you mean?" "I mean create an actual support program for families like ours. Not therapy or intervention, but community building, practical support for parents who are learning to raise children who don't fit traditional molds." Marcus felt the familiar stirring of excitement that came with recognizing a problem that needed solving, like what Eddie's doing with the housing project, but for families instead of individuals. Exactly. A place where parents can learn from each other, where children can see other kids like themselves thriving, where the focus is on building community instead of fixing deficits. Marcus thought about the families they had met that evening, about the relief he had seen in parents' faces when they realized they weren't alone in their journey. "We could use part of the Peterson development site, create family housing that's designed for children with sensory sensitivities, community spaces where kids can play in ways that feel natural to them. Mixed income housing," Rebecca added, warming to the vision. "Not just for families in crisis, but for any family that wants to raise children in a community that celebrates differences instead of just tolerating them." Daniel looked up from his organizing, clearly listening to his parents' planning, despite appearing focused on his rocks. "Can Eddie live there too?" "Of course, buddy," Marcus replied. "Eddie's part of our family now." "And can we have a garden like ours? The best garden we can possibly grow," Rebecca promised. Daniel smiled and returned to his collections, satisfied that the adults in his life were creating a world where children like him could flourish. 1 year after that first encounter at Lincoln Park, Marcus stood on the construction site of what was now being called the Whitfield Peterson Community Development. The first phase of housing was nearly complete, and families were beginning to move into apartments designed with accessibility, sensory considerations, and community connection as primary features. Eddie approached from the community garden, his clothes dirt-stained from the morning's planting session. He looked healthier than Marcus had ever seen him, filled out from regular meals and steady sleep, his weathered face carrying contentment instead of grief. "How are the new residents settling in?" Marcus asked. "Better than we hoped," Eddie replied. "Mrs. Rodriguez told me yesterday that this is the first place her son Miguel has ever felt safe being himself. Yesterday, he helped 3 other kids build a fort without having a single meltdown." Marcus felt the familiar warmth that came with evidence that their investment was changing actual lives. "And the adult programs? David's job training initiative has a 90% placement rate. But more than that, people are staying employed because they have stable housing and community support. Turns out, when you treat people with dignity and give them real opportunities, they thrive." They walked through the development together, past the community center where Daniel's monthly family support group now met, past the workshops where residents learned job skills and pursued creative projects, past the playground designed for children with varying sensory needs and physical abilities. "There's something I want to show you," Eddie said, leading Marcus toward a bench that overlooked the entire development. Mounted on the bench was a small plaque that read, "In memory of Jeremy Peterson, who taught us that everyone finds their way home eventually." Marcus felt his throat tighten as he read the inscription. "Eddie, this is beautiful. Jeremy always said that the best way to honor someone's life was to live in a way that made their existence matter. This whole project, everything we've built here, it's Jeremy's legacy as much as Daniel's gift to us." Marcus settled onto the bench beside Eddie, looking out over the community they had created together. Children were playing in the garden. Adults were gathered around picnic tables sharing lunch. Teenagers were working on an art project that would become a mural on the community center wall. "Do you think we did it?" Marcus asked. "Do you think we actually solved something?" Eddie was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the thoughtfulness that characterized all his responses. I think we proved that when you see people clearly and love them accordingly, everybody wins. I think we showed that problems get solved when the people who have lived them get to help design the solutions. And I think, Eddie continued, we created something that will keep growing long after we're gone. Every family that finds community here, every child who grows up knowing their differences are valued, every person who discovers they belong somewhere, they'll carry that knowledge forward and create more belonging wherever they go. Marcus thought about Daniel, who was now 10 years old and thriving in their homeschool program. His son had become a confident, curious, joyful child who contributed to their family and community in ways Marcus never could have imagined when they started this journey. Eddie, I need to tell you something. What's that? 3 years ago, I thought success meant accumulating wealth and power. I thought being a good father meant providing financial security and protecting my child from anything difficult. I thought love meant trying to change people into who you needed them to be. Marcus paused, watching a group of children work together to plant flowers in the community garden, their collaboration natural and joyful. You taught me that success means creating spaces where people can flourish as themselves. You taught me that being a good father means seeing my child clearly and loving him accordingly. You taught me that love means accepting people exactly as they are while supporting them to become everything they're capable of being. Eddie's weathered face cracked into the gentle smile that had become familiar to everyone in their community. Marcus, you taught me something too. What's that? You taught me that it's never too late to start over, that healing happens when people with resources choose to use them wisely, and that family isn't about blood or law. It's about showing up for each other when it matters. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their community live and grow around them. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photo from that morning. Daniel and 3 other children from the development working together to build a structure out of natural materials they had gathered from the garden. "Look at this," he said, showing Eddie the picture. In the photo, Daniel was clearly the leader of the project, his understanding of patterns and engineering helping the group create something beautiful and functional. But more than that, he looked happy, confident, completely himself in the company of friends who valued his unique contributions. "That's a boy who knows he belongs in the world," Eddie observed. "That's a boy whose father finally learned how to see him," Marcus replied. As they prepared to leave the bench, Marcus noticed something in the distance that made him smile. Rebecca was approaching with Daniel and 3 other families from their support group, clearly planning to spend the afternoon exploring the community they had all helped create. Daniel spotted Marcus and Eddie and began moving toward them with the purposeful walk that meant he had something important to share. When he reached them, he pulled something from his pocket, a new stone, this one smooth and white, with veining that looked like rivers running through snow. "I found this for the community garden," Daniel announced, holding out the stone. "Eddie says special stones help gardens grow better." Marcus accepted the stone, understanding that his son was contributing to their shared project in the way that felt most natural to him, by offering something beautiful that he had discovered and valued. "This is perfect, Daniel," Marcus said. "Where should we place it?" Daniel considered the question with the serious attention he gave to all important decisions. "Next to Jeremy's bench, so everyone knows this place is for people who need to find their way home." As they walked toward the garden to place Daniel's stone, Marcus felt a completeness he had never experienced before. His family was whole, not because they had fixed their problems, but because they had learned to love each other and themselves exactly as they were. Their community was thriving, not because they had eliminated difficulties, but because they had created systems that honored human complexity and supported everyone's journey toward flourishing. Most importantly, Daniel was growing into himself with confidence and joy, surrounded by people who saw his differences as gifts rather than deficits. He would face challenges as he grew. The world was still not entirely prepared for people who experienced it differently, but he would face those challenges knowing he belonged, knowing he was valued, knowing he had family and community who would support him in being exactly who he was meant to be. That evening, as the sun set over their community development, Marcus sat with Daniel on Jeremy's bench, while Rebecca and Eddie prepared dinner in the community kitchen. Daniel was arranging the stones they had collected throughout the day, creating patterns that pleased him while humming the melody that had become the soundtrack to their family's transformation. "Dad," Daniel said suddenly, looking up from his stone arrangement. "Yeah, buddy?" "I'm glad Eddie saw me." Marcus felt his chest swell with emotion at his son's simple statement. "Me too, Daniel. Me too. And I'm glad you learned how to see me too." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they carried the weight of forgiveness and love and acknowledgement of the journey they had traveled together. "I'm sorry it took me so long to learn," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. Daniel looked at him with the direct gaze that had once been so rare, but now felt like a gift freely given. "It's okay. Eddie says some stones take longer to get where they belong, but that makes them more special when they finally arrive." Marcus pulled his son closer, this remarkable boy who had taught him that love was not about changing people, but about creating space for them to be themselves. Daniel leaned into the embrace, humming softly, his contentment evident in every line of his relaxed body. From the community kitchen came the sounds of their chosen family preparing a meal together. Rebecca's laughter, Eddie's gentle voice, other residents calling greetings as they passed by. It was the sound of belonging, of home, of a life built around love instead of fear. As the stars began to appear overhead, Marcus made a silent promise to Jeremy Peterson, the young Marine who had died believing that everyone deserved to be loved for who they were. Jeremy's death had led to Eddie's loss, which had led to his homelessness, which had led to that miraculous encounter in Lincoln Park when a broken man had seen Daniel clearly and taught his father how to do the same. The circle was complete. The stone had found its place, and love had indeed found a way. Years later, when researchers studied the Whitfield-Peterson community development as a model for inclusive housing and family support, they would focus on the innovative programming, the wraparound services, the measurable outcomes in terms of housing stability and employment rates. But the people who lived there, the families who found community there, the children who grew up knowing they belonged exactly as they were, they would tell a different story. They would talk about the homeless veteran who taught them to see value in differences, the wealthy businessman who learned that true success meant creating space for everyone to flourish, and the autistic boy whose simple acceptance of love transformed an entire community. They would talk about the day that love stopped trying to change people and started helping them become everything they were meant to be. And they would carry that story forward, creating belonging wherever they went, proving that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the smallest acts of recognition, acceptance, and grace. In the end, Marcus had indeed made a life-changing decision. That day, he watched a stranger care for his son, but the change wasn't just in his life. It rippled outward, creating waves of transformation that would continue long after any of them were gone. Because that's what love does when it's finally allowed to flow freely. It changes everything it touches, and everything those things touch, until the whole world becomes a place where everyone can find their way home.